where you're joining from today. My name's Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting, and I'm going to introduce a guest here today. But today we're doing our weekly Tuesday live stream. We do a live stream interview on things related to digital transformation. We cover everything from digital strategy to change management to software selection, implementation best practices, architecture, data, really anything related to digital strategy we cover here in this live stream. By being part of this live stream, you're actually part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast. So what we do is we film this part of the podcast live in front of an audience, get your participation, get your questions, and then we edit this and make it part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast, which gets released every Wednesday. So you'll find this episode a week from tomorrow when that episode comes out. So as I said, my name's Eric Kimberling. I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. Today's topic is going to be digital strategy and software evaluation. So we're going to talk about sort of the front end of a digital transformation, the definition of a strategy, a roadmap, finding the right technologies, all that good stuff. We're gonna unpack that here today, and we encourage you to ask your questions. I've got some starting point questions that I'll dive into with Tony as we do introductions here. But I encourage everyone here that's listening to please chime in and jump in with any questions you might have. And to start, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. What city or country are you joining from here today? We'd love to hear where the global audience is here today. We tend to get people from all over the world, so it's interesting to hear where everyone is. So please feel free to drop in the chat where you're joining from today. And also, if you have questions along the way as we get started, please drop in the chat at any point those questions. We'll sort of cherry pick the questions along the way, and Tony and I will unpack those as we go. So. All that being said, our topic today is digital strategy, software selection. What we're going to talk about here today is how do we define the right strategy and roadmap for us as an organization? How do we find the right software? All that good stuff we're gonna talk about here today. And joining me to cover that topic in a bit more detail is Tony Ford with Third Stage Consulting. So Tony, welcome to the show here today.
Thanks, Eric. I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to some of the questions that we're going to get from the audience. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess just to start here before we get to some of the audience questions, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background leading up to joining Third Stage, and also tell us what you do at Third Stage.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've been in the industry for a long time. Been in management consulting for a significant part of my career. I've worked with some of the well-known large integrators in the industry. Some of them recognize names you'll recognize. So we won't share those names, but spent a lot of time in the business. I spent a lot of time with one of the large software vendors as well, executive of one of those companies. But I've got a lot of experience. I've worn a lot of hats. I've worn the large program management, project management hats. I've been a solution architect, primarily focused around the ERP world. I've got a lot of experience in data architecture as well. I actually ran a data administration function for a large pharmaceutical in my career. So I've got a pretty good, well-rounded wealth of experience, both breadth and depth in a number of areas. So when it comes to digital strategies and digital transformations, we can certainly talk and from a lot of perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you've got that architecture perspective, the program management perspective, a lot of different hats that you've worn on these projects. What is it you do out here at Third Stage?
Well, I'm a digital transformation strategy consultant for Third Stage. So when there are opportunities to engage us to help corporations chart a course where they are trying to make some changes in their business, and then, of course, to deploy a technology or set of technology strategies around that. That's where we get engaged to help them with that. Then also to help them with, once we chart the course, to make some solutions along the process.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so you've had some good exposure throughout your career to all different types of industries. And actually, we were just talking before we went live here about your family. It has been in a number of different businesses as well, so you got to see kind of an entrepreneurial spirit within your upbringing. So
Yep.
At a young age, I imagine you started seeing maybe not digital transformation per se, but just seeing how businesses operate at an early point in life.
Absolutely.
Good deal. So I guess to start, if we just back up and just start at the 20,000-foot view, why is it so important for organizations to have a clearly defined digital strategy and roadmap?
Well, there's a lot of change going on in various industries, and companies are growing. You really need to start thinking about, rather than, well, I've got a problem for today. A lot of times what happens is we have a problem for today. We start focusing on a very specific and targeted problem, and you start to fix one problem, then you cause another. So having a digital strategy really takes a more of a holistic view of things, both horizontally and vertically. And we're going to talk about that maybe later, but so that as you're trying to develop a strategy, you're examining why you're going to go in a certain direction. And that is usually centered around deriving certain values in the process, and also trying to fix certain pain points, strategic pain points that are causing the organization a lot of problems and inhibiting the organization from achieving whatever strategies or goals that they have to achieve. So the whole idea is to take more of a holistic approach, and try to make sure that all the components, and by the way, it's not just a technology component, right? But it's a lot of components, and trying to make sure all those components fit, both for the short term and the long term, as you go through the cycle of looking at your technology transformation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you started to touch on this question, but when you talk about the components of a digital strategy, you said it's not just the technical pieces, but there's other components to an effective digital strategy. What are some of those other components, or some of the key things that people should be thinking about as they define their digital strategies?
I think probably to start with, right, is just to make sure that you have a really good understanding of where your business is trying to go. And because that really becomes the compass, if you will, for defining what technologies and what strategies that you want to deploy. Then, of course, as you're going through the process, it becomes the point of coming back to make sure and confirm that you're still on target. Because sometimes as we're going through a transformation, we may drift one way or the other, depending on the challenges of the day that might focus us to go down one path. But what happens is, if we begin to understand what the business drivers are, they tend to keep you on target, right? So that's probably one. The second part of that is to make sure that those strategies are in alignment with whatever the technologies are, the strategies are, and the roadmap that you're building. So that, again, it becomes, once you've got that alignment of business to solution to strategy to roadmap, you can always now begin to come back and use it as a way of making sure you're staying on course. So that's one. But certainly understanding your overall vision for where you want to go. Often when we get into some of the executive workshops, one of the first questions we're asking is describe what your transformed organization is going to look like. And sometimes companies have a real clear vision of what that is. They actually have a stated vision statement, right? And sometimes they don't. So what we usually do is we say, well, can you describe, if you had to describe the attributes of where you're trying to go, what does that look like, right? So we try to do that. We also try to identify strategically what are the major goals of the organization. Another component. We also try to make sure that we understand what the strategic requirements are, the strategic challenges. I interchange those terms because a lot of times, we talk about the challenges, but those become the requirements. And when I say strategic, and I'm going to use an example. We had one client that was fairly large in size, had over 70 divisions. And so with 70 divisions with four major business units. And so the challenge for them was trying to consolidate that into one perspective, or one centralized set of strategies. And so what we did there was clearly define, well, what is a strategic requirement? This is probably more of the common requirements to all of the divisions that they could all agree on were very important. Obviously, there's more than just that set of requirements, but those were the ones they decided were strategic to all of the business units, right?
Right.
Certainly understanding the improvement opportunities, the challenges, strategic challenges, prioritization, really important around strategy, because those tend to direct, once you start to feel for where your programs, the strategic programs are, where the priorities are, where do I start? Because a lot of times we don't know where we start, where the value is. You may find that there's some projects that are strategic, but they're low hanging in that the cost is low, but there's a real opportunity to create value. So understanding what those priorities are very important as well, because they'll drive the transformation program. So those are some of the really, of course, identifying and understanding what your strategic risks are through the transformation. As you're going through the process, right? Making sure you understand, well, there's some risk associated with that as well. And then lastly, I think having a real strategic understanding of organizational change. We find that organizational change is probably a really, really important part of the process. So that's a component that we really focus on during the process.
Yeah. You talked about risk, which is interesting in the context of digital strategy. What are some examples of risks that organizations should be thinking about, or some examples of common risks that organizations identify at this point in the cycle when they're first defining their overall strategy and roadmap?
I think one of the biggest risks is just making sure that you understand requirements and how they'll line up to your business. This is one that is really undervalued, I think, in some of our clients that we go to. A lot of times what we find is we want to go from the startup of this process and go right quick to software selection. And so one of the pitfalls is the digital transformation. Sometimes when you look at a software selection, it's kind of packaged, viewed as one process, and it's really not one process. They're separate, and they have separate objectives. And the software selection is more of an output of the digital transformation. So probably one risk area is assuming that the digital transformation and the strategies that come out of that somehow are a part of the software selection. They're really not. And so separating and not making that gray and creating that and making that one part as part of the software is really important, because then what you start to do is you start to look at this as a business exercise rather than a software selection first. So I find that happens more often than you would think. Even with some of the larger corporations that we work with, the need to do your due diligence up front, and I think that's important, because what happens is it does help the process downstream when you put the time in up front to make sure that you understand the business and how it aligns to a specific technology strategy that you're developing. So that's a really, really big one. And I think probably the second one right after that is really underestimating organizational change and the impact that it may have. Obviously, if you're doing a really whole scale change of technologies or applications to support your business, it's going to affect your organization, not just from the standpoint of the organization and potentially resistance to the change, but also operationally, where you're going to have to change how you're doing things in your business that will cause a lot of discomfort, a lot of need for programs to help with the change process.
Gotcha.
So those are probably some of the ones that really we're seeing that cause some of the biggest problems in the process of digital transformation.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Yeah, that's a good overview. And I want to turn to the audience real quick and just highlight some of the where some of the people are joining from here today. We have Cam on YouTube from San Diego, Anurada from Toronto, who's on LinkedIn as well. We have Third Stage joining from Denver, Colorado. Sheena from on LinkedIn from California. Thanks for being here today, Sheena. Parisa from Denver. We have Edwin from Dallas, Texas, as well as Prabhakar from Bangalore as well. So thanks everyone for joining here today, and those of you that have shared where you're from here today. I really appreciate you joining here today. And then also we have David from Ireland too. That's another person that's joined here from Ireland on LinkedIn as well. So thanks for joining from different parts of the world here today. And of course, if you have questions, please chime in at any point. We're talking about digital strategy. We're going to get into software selection here in just a moment. But actually, while we're on that topic, I'll kind of want to go a little bit deeper into that point you made about how digital strategy, software selection are not the same thing. Sometimes companies just jump right into the software selection. Sometimes they sort of back up and define that digital strategy. Maybe just help us unpack that a little bit more. How are those two things really different? Why are they not the same thing? And why is it important to sort of view those as distinct phases of a digital transformation?
Okay. If we talk about it just from a process standpoint, when you're going through a digital transformation strategy, you're really looking at my audience that I'm having a conversation with is different. I'm going to be talking to the executive team within an organization. We are now taking a longer term perspective of the organization. So we really, really want to understand strategically speaking where they're trying to go with the company, what they believe are the challenges to get there, what they believe are the potential solutions to what they see as strategic challenges or problems that they're having in the organization. And so the audience is different. You're taking a longer term perspective. It is a holistic, because now we're looking at the entire enterprise, and we're looking at all of the challenges. So we're not diving into one specific operational area. So that's a real big part of that, right? And then we are building a series of programs that are prioritized into an overall roadmap. So right off the bat, you're seeing it's a longer term, it's more holistic, it's more an executive perspective, it's business driven. And so those are the key aspects, as opposed to the software selection now where, excuse me, we're now moving a little bit closer to the operation. It's a little bit more targeted potentially. And we're actually doing functional deeper dives to understand specifically what are some of the challenges specifically in certain areas. We may have a strategic challenge around a specific aspect of supply chain. But now I'm going to say, okay, operationally, am I having some problems in my procurement? Am I having some problems in my warehousing and logistics in shipping? Am I having some problems in my production management cycle? So we're digging down deeper operationally. We're trying to identify what some of the pain is more specifically. We're also trying to target now operational KPIs that are, by the way, are linked back to strategic goals. So one of the things that we're trying to do, I have a wheel that I call the business solution wheel, where we start with the vision and we work on the wheel. Well, one of the points on the wheel is operational objectives, and we want to make sure that they are tied back to specific strategies and goals, so that we'll keep continuing this linkage. Because the whole idea is, at some point when I create a project charter, right, I want to be able to go, I've got a KPI, which is an improvement KPI, that becomes an ROI back to the project, and I can tie that all the way back. So we're trying to make sure we do. So operationally, we're just digging down deeper, and it's more targeted and focused on a specific application or functional area, potentially, with more details.
Yeah, and I can see how if you just jump to that step in the process of just starting to evaluate technology, then it could get pretty overwhelming pretty quickly in terms of determining, well, what kind of technology do I look at? Even in your example, supply chain, you've got supply chain management standalone solutions, you've got standalone warehouse management solutions, procurement solutions, logistics solutions, you've got enterprise-wide ERP systems that can do all that stuff. So if you look at all those different buckets, I mean, you could be caught up in analysis paralysis for a long time just trying to figure out, what technologies are out there. So that's the first, as you were talking, that struck me as well.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that we see, specifically, when I'm going to back up, when we go back to the digital strategy, is you consistently hear that I don't have visibility across the organization. I'm almost every time I walk in the door, some of the biggest challenges that we hear about strategically around business integration. Let's not talk about technology. It's just a business integration where I'm taking an order on the front end. And as a salesperson, I want to know the status of that order, but I can't see, because I can't see in the production cycle if I'm producing something out of the process. I can't see where it's at. I can't see logistically in a warehouse and shipping where's my customer's order. I can't see. And if I've got holes on orders, if I got holes, why is there a hole? So you see this whole. And then also in the approval cycle, right? You see the automation of approvals and integration across multiple organizations within the process cycle. I can't see the visibility of things. That's a really big one. So again, the holistic approach that you get out of the enterprise takes that perspective, and usually the issues with the digital strategy are those points of integration where I'm handing off information or I'm acquiring information from one department or one organization to the next. Those are the places where you tend to see some of the biggest challenges in the organizations.
Interesting. Yeah. And then it's sort of a related question from the audience here. This is from Kyler on LinkedIn. How do you achieve executive alignment regarding viewing a selection as a holistic business decision rather than just an IT project? So how do you get executives on board with the fact that this is not just, to your point earlier, this is not just a technical decision or a technology evaluation? How do you get that alignment internally, or have you seen that dynamic had to overcome before?
Yeah. And we've seen that. I've seen that type of resistance, right? Even at the executive level, right? Because again, there's a tendency to want to jump right to the software selection. That's a big challenge that we have when we go through these workshops and this digital strategy process. It starts first off with the executive workshops, making sure that we understand the business and the value, and very quickly demonstrating the linkage. And I say that it's important to make sure as quickly as you can to make sure that the executives can see the alignment in the value that a technology may produce out of the process. So that's one. And as the second thing is, as we're going through the process of identifying all the components, to continuously demonstrate the alignment and how, if I've got a strategic requirement or a challenge, how is that impacting or inhibiting a goal that I'm trying to achieve? So you got to make sure that we're continually aligning and continuing. If you're doing all these, if you're compartmentalizing everything and creating silos of information, and you're not linking that back, even at the strategic level, you're going to lose your audience pretty fast, and they won't see the value. But once you're linking it and creating that linkage and alignment, and even to the point where you start at the operational level, tying specific business process back to a strategic goal, and immediately they go, oh, so for me to achieve this strategic goal, I've got a business process supporting it, but it's being inhibited by a pain point that's causing us not to be able to perform in a manner that's helping me achieve my goal. If they can see that linkage, then it really helps the process of bringing the executive team over to the point of realizing the value in the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I could see organizations in today's day and age, especially with the world that we're in, where a lot of software vendors are sort of migrating their solutions, their old on-premise solutions, to the cloud. And now they're sunsetting their older solutions, like Microsoft's doing it. They're sunsetting Great Plains and kind of forcing you onto D365, or SAP's doing it with R3 and ECC, forcing you onto S4HANA. And they're all doing it. I don't mean to pick on just SAP or Microsoft. They're all sort of following a similar path to sort of pushing their customers over to the newer systems. it seems like a lot of organizations as a result of that are sort of bypassing this whole digital strategy thing, because it's sort of like what you're talking about is the big picture, long-term view. And a lot of them are getting down in the nooks and crannies of, well, I've got to replace my old Microsoft or SAP or ERP system now. So that's my digital strategy. I'm going to replace my legacy system. Do you see that dynamic a lot more nowadays
Yeah,
than we saw 10 years ago?
I do. And the mistake that some of the organizations are making is, again, focusing on one problem
Yeah.
and one solution. And it's kind of like I've got it's the more technologies that you have in your portfolio, the greater the chance you're going to break something by introducing something new. So it becomes very important now. If I've got a large organization, and I'm not just saying for a large organization, but if I've got a portfolio of digital solutions that are supporting my business, and I focus on one, you really potentially could break something, right? It's kind of
Right.
like if I'm doing an upgrade, right? If I'm on an ERP system on an upgrade cycle, right? If you introduce a custom solution, this is the whole point of the cloud, right? Which is to try to eliminate or limit my impact to anything that I built on that I custom built. The more chances that you build something custom, more opportunities that you introduce something into the software solution that's going to break something later. So same kind of principle applies here, right? I was going to come back to something that you were focusing on too, and I'm going to come back to it. One of the other areas that we find in the digital strategy transformation that companies are overlooking a little bit more than you would think is not just looking at your company digitally, horizontally, and functionally, but looking at the technology stack. Just recently had a client that they did an excellent job of building their digital strategy long term. And by the way, they had a lot of divisions, very large portfolio of technologies. So when you saw the picture, it looked like a jigsaw puzzle when I first looked at the picture. And did an excellent job of looking at the software layer of the technology stack. So if at the top, I've got the software, then data, then infrastructure. They did an excellent job of a strategy across the top two layers of their technology stack. But they did identify an infrastructure strategy, but they had not done a real examination of their solutions when they started to go down that path of doing a software selection. And what we found was they really overlooked the infrastructure layer, which, by the way, became a very important part of the strategy since they had so many components and they had a longer journey, maybe a 5-year journey, to transform the organization. So you wanted to make sure that you've got a sound foundation to build on from an infrastructure standpoint. If you got to constantly be moving a lot of pieces. So I think one of the areas that, from a digital strategy, the risk area, if you will, is that a lot of corporations need to pay a little bit more attention to their infrastructure and the tools that come along with the migration in and out of the cloud, the migration tools and the support of how you migrate in. All these components become very important as part of that strategy. And that there's some oversight in doing that. And there's also a sense of moving to the cloud is a lot easier than you think. And so I think there's some underestimation of going from on-prem solution to a cloud solution, that somehow we're going to flip a switch and there's going to be some nice integration. I mean, my migration tools will get me there pretty quickly, and we underestimate that process.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's a good way to really think outside the box of just a application. Even if you were just implementing an application and moving it to the cloud, there's a lot more to it. As far as data, the integration points, the overall architecture, obviously all the process changes, the change management strategy that you talked about. I mean, that's just a lot of stuff. And what I think is really interesting that you're talking about here is that in most cases, I would say, and tell me if you agree or disagree with this, but it seems like in most cases, it's not, even if a client thinks it's going to be one system, it's going to be one ERP system, a core ERP system that does everything. It's usually not. Usually you've got other stuff you've got to tie into and integrate with, or you end up in a best of breed scenario, even though you don't really want to, because you need different capabilities that the core system doesn't have. Is that something you found, or what are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. There's never, even when you lock down on a single ERP solution that you think let's face it, it's never 100% fit, right?
Right.
So there's always an opportunity for third-party components. There's always a opportunity for some custom solutions. There's always an opportunity for even some of the software vendors who are using third parties to build components that are branded to their own solution. There's always potential there for those types of scenarios where you've got to have hooks into different components. So integration of the different pieces and ensuring that you've got platforms that enable the ease of integration or easier integration, right? Becomes very important. So again, it comes back to taking more of a broad look and recognizing that a digital strategy, one of the outcomes of a digital strategy is the blueprint. And the blueprint is really just to help you define the characteristic of what your technology should look like. And so now you have a specification for a technology, an ERP technology, but it's not defining that specific solution. It's saying, here's what the model, here's what your technology should look like. Here are the capabilities it should have. And now that becomes a measuring tool. Again, when you go to look at your actual ES software selection, you have something to go back to and measure against because you have built a blueprint of what that solution to look like to enable your business to achieve what it needs to achieve.
Yeah, it's a good point. And this question from the audience here from Prabhakar, I hope I pronounced that right, from Prabhakar on LinkedIn asks the question of share your thoughts on this comment. The change in technology after we start our digital transformation with the technology and the expectation from the leadership to align our existing program with this new technology. I think what he's saying is, what are your thoughts of that common dynamic where an executive says that our digital strategy is to implement this technology and we're going to align everything around, the program and everything we do around that technology. I think what he's getting at is what you were talking about earlier, which is what you don't want to do, or at least that's my perception. If I misunderstood the question, please, correct me. But what are your thoughts there on do you see that dynamic and how do you overcome that dynamic of, hey, our digital strategy is to implement this technology, or we're going to focus just on deploying that technology and doing everything we need to do?
Okay, I think there's two ways to approach that dynamic, right? One is when you build your digital strategy, it does become, and I'm going to use that word compass again. It's the compass that allows you to come back and litmus test that if I'm taking a specific digital strategy or and let's say I'm midstream, I've got my roadmap and I'm actually maybe in phase 2, right, of my roadmap. And I obviously, if you've got a longer journey, you've got a longer road path, there's always potential that somewhere your market's going to change. And part of the solution for building a digital strategy is to build for change. That has to be one of the objectives of digital strategy is to make sure that I've got a blueprint that creates flexibility and ability to scale as my markets and my industry changes. So that's one thing that's going to aid in the process downstream, is that I've anticipated change, and I'm building my digital solutions around flexibility to change with my industry and so forth. That's one. Second one is, since you've built a digital strategy, is you've got blueprint and you've got a roadmap, you now again have this tool that you're using that continuously gives you a place to go back and check and make sure. And even if you're in the IT world and you start to see maybe we're drifting away, you have a way to come back to the executive team that says, again, we have a solution that's aligned to specific values. Are we moving away from that? Or if our business values have changed, is our technology still aligned? So you have a constant way of going back to you and checking off whether my strategy is still sound, whether my if my business has changed or the technology changes, is everything still sound? So you've got to go measure against.
Yeah.
Maybe hoping that's answering the question. I think the main thing is to make sure that you have, and the other thing too is to continuously evaluate against it, right? We build a digital strategy and we just say, okay, that's it. We're not, it's never going to change, but that's not going to happen because it is going to change. So you have to constantly come back to it and use it as a tool that it is and evaluate, maybe year to year or what have you, project to project, am I staying course? And to challenge that strategy to make sure that what we're doing is still in line with what we were trying to achieve in the beginning.
Right. Yeah, that's sound advice and a good way to sort of get outside the myopic view of just deploying technology as well. Here's a comment, but I'm actually going to turn this into a question. And this is from Ghassan on LinkedIn. He says, I've yet to see a tool that will help simulate a cloud migration project whereby you input all your existing on-premise solutions along with integration points, and the tool will provide you with an estimated cost along with the timeline. Let me finish the question here that it led off the screen here. Along with the timeline, providing offerings from various infrastructures as a service providers. So Ghassan's sort of thinking ahead here to like, we have the technology to do it, I suppose, with artificial intelligence, machine learning, ways that you could put inputs to sort of predict how long a project is going to take. So he's making the comment that tool doesn't seem to exist as far as some sort of automated tool where you just plug in what technologies you have now, what you're going to, and what your integration points are, and it's going to spit out some sort of estimate. Why do you think that doesn't exist yet? If only were that easy.
Yeah. Well, no, he's probably right. It doesn't exist. There's just so many different components. There's so many factors that influence. Often, I'm going to say this too, often with third stage, we produce a lot of materials and opinions. And a lot of times, we have clients that want to take our opinions and apply them to all circumstances. And of course, they don't apply to all circumstances. They're like any other study or case, like that any other large strategy organization might produce. They have their place. And so you have to understand what the constraints are around a specific opinion and recognize that with each scenario, each opportunity company, some of the factors change that the criteria changes for an input that to the criteria will change and will deviate an opinion from what's real in my own organization. So you have to be careful when you're using professional opinions because they're good start points. They're good to help you. They're good for confirming. I like to use multiple points when I'm trying to confirm a strategy, confirm an understanding of something. I go to multiple sources, and what they do is they only give you confidence that they give you a high degree of confidence that I'm doing the right things, but they should never be applied in a way that says this is the gospel and I'm going to be using this in my own scenario. You have to apply your own criteria and requirements to that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, very much. And then you've also got, you talked earlier about change management, Tony, and how change management is such an important part of this. And that human dynamic is A, super unpredictable, and B, it's one of the biggest variables or impacts to your implementation duration and complexity and cost and all that good stuff. And that's probably the hardest part to predict is how your organization's actually going to respond to the changes and how well they're going to adapt to the changes. What about this question? Another question here from LinkedIn, which is an interesting one, is what do you do when a client thinks because of vendor pressure that they're receiving that they need a certain system or software, but their requirements tell a different story? Is that, I'm sure that never happens in our industry, right? A vendor pressuring a client or trying to convince them that their software is a good fit when in fact it's not. How do you vet that out? I mean, what are some of the things you've seen with our clients as far as getting past that?
Funny. I just recently had one of those as well too. So yeah. I think and you do see vendors, putting that kind of pressure on an organization. I think the best solution to that, right, is to again come back with as much verification from multiple sources that will help an organization feel comfortable that maybe what a vendor is saying may not be exactly what the perception of the marketplace. At some point, you've got to say, okay, the market says this. We've got multiple validation points that maybe an opinion is a little bit different than what the way others are seeing it. The other thing too is you got to always come back to say, so my requirements are dictating that I need this type of software, this system with these capabilities. You have to be sure that you understand what your capabilities are relative to a specific requirement or a feature of a technology, and have a good understanding of what that is. So if you've done your homework and you dug in, if you hired someone to do it for you and they've dug in and identified the requirements at a level that you feel comfortable with, right, then you can feel comfortable that maybe you have a different sort of opinion than the vendors are providing to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that clarity that you started off the conversation talking about, that clarity of where you're headed as an organization, what your goals and objectives are, and how this project potentially aligns with that strategy. I think that it just sort of gives you the guardrails and the vision and the direction to be able to vet some of that out. So it becomes more clear when it's not a good fit or when it is a good fit, whatever technology you might be considering.
Yeah, I'll give you a good example. Recently had a client that where the client was told that the vendor had a public versus a private cloud solution, and while their public cloud solution may not have met all the requirements their private cloud solution would, right? Mm. Well, if you were looking for a certain level of control and extensibility that you might get in a little bit more on-premise like scenario, then yeah, that might play to what you want to do. But if your long-term strategy, right, is to really conform to the capabilities that a cloud would provide you and the gains that you get from a cloud, there's some trade-off that you have to consider. And that's one of the things that, again, a digital strategy helps us to understand too. What are the trade-offs when I'm trying to determine a path to go down? And so one of the trade-offs, obviously, in a private cloud might be that I'm gaining some things and more control, but I'm also going to incur some cost in the same way that I had on premise. And so you've got to be very careful that you understand the trade-offs that you're getting when you're going down certain paths like that. So we had one of those here recently.
Yeah, that's a great point. That last thing you said, which is there's always trade-offs. Even when you've defined your digital strategy, you've selected the technology or technologies that are going to best align with that. Even that best fit for your path forward is going to have risks and trade-offs. And you started off the conversation by talking a little bit about risks too. And I think that's another thing is, it's exciting to define a digital strategy. You want to be optimistic and think about this ideal future state, but you also have to recognize that there's some landmine pitfalls along the way that we've got to navigate.
As IT organizations, we have to be very careful, especially if you have a culture that says, I want to build something, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be, we all want to be creative when it comes to our jobs. But if you've got companies that have put a lot of investment, as many of these ERP companies have done in their software, years and years of development across multiple industries. They've looked at every many scenarios for requirements. They just have a lot built in, a lot of money and investment. So you have to start again. This is where having a digital strategy helps you stay on target, because if you're wanting to build something as opposed to conform to a solution, technology, digital solution, but the cost is going to be, you're not gaining anything. This is where your digital strategy and the alignment of that digital strategy kind of keeps you on course. Again, you got something to go back to that says if I move away from a specific strategy that will get me at a certain goal or and maybe it's a financial goal, then this is where that strategy comes into play. It kind of helps you stay on course with those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Here's a question from John on YouTube. He asked the question, what are the best practices for change management when introducing a digital strategy? That's a pretty big question, but maybe you could cherry pick a couple things that you've seen, and you're introducing or defining a digital strategy. What are some of the key things that you should keep in mind or focus on or address?
Yeah, I think certainly it's really important to take the pulse of your organization. We often do surveys. And those can be controversial, and there should be some sensitivity to those to surveys. But surveys are good, especially from the people's perspective, to get a feel for how change is going to play in your organization. And you certainly want to be able to flesh out where there may be some potential resistance. Resistance can be on purpose, or it can be, there's resistance, direct and indirect resistance. And so you want to try to flesh out those things and try to understand, and so that you can start to build the right programs around them. In particular, a lot of organizational changes focus around communication. So you want to make sure that you are being effective, not only doing the digital transformation exercise, because people get a little nervous there, but also when you start down your digital roadmap, the various projects, how do you communicate the value? How do you communicate the change that's coming? That sort of thing. The other thing too is to make sure that you have a good understanding operationally where the impact of change is going to occur.
Yeah.
So change is really two things: it's organizational and it's operational. So making sure, we typically do in a digital strategy exercise, we try to do our best at understanding both operational and organizational. We tend to get, when we do our functional deep dive, we get a little bit more understanding around the operational level, but you certainly want to understand those. And of course, and to develop the appropriate programs to help with the transformation as you move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about hypothetical but real scenario that I think you and I have both seen? I'm a CIO or a client, and I say, Tony, that's great. I know most of your other clients have problems with change management, but our team's ready for this change. They hate the old technology. They know the processes are broken, and so change management is really not going to be an issue. It's going to be pretty easy for us. Is that something you've seen? And if so, how do you overcome that misperception that change is somehow going to be easy because people are on board with the change early on?
Yeah, the first thing is we do try to convince especially during the executive digital strategy, is to get the executive to test that a little bit. There's no harm in doing some level of surveying to get a feel for what that looks like, And what we try to do is we tell them that when you think there's not resistance to change, there always is some resistance organizationally to change. And depending on the scope of the change, the numbers of operational areas are going to be impacted. If the scope tends to be fairly broad, you can almost guarantee that there's going to be some fear, some concern about the newer technologies. You're going to get something there. Then the other thing too is you start to point out, as you're going through workshops, you start to point out those sorts of things start to surface in workshops. And so one of the things that we've done as we go through digital strategy is we do like a checkpoint at some point. We release a list of observations that we see in some of our workshops, especially the ones that start to validate an opinion that we have about organizational change or processes, and where some of the pain in the organization may be. We start to, outside of identifying specific pain points, we raise observations that we think are important that the executive teams need to be aware of. And so we try to flush those out. So it's kind of two things. It's one, you use surveys, but you're also capturing observations during the workshops and trying to flush those things out and raise the visibility to the organization, executive organization.
Yeah,
that may be their perception. And a lot of times what we find is the executive perception may be a little bit off as you move down the ranks a little bit. Often what we do, another strategy that we do is if we're going through executive workshop, we separate if it's a larger organization, we can do this, but we'll separate workshops between, say, the senior executive team and maybe an operational management layer. And what the idea here is to see, is there alignment with the executive team and the mid-level management team that may be actually in the operational, managing the operational functions. And that's another litmus test to see how aligned the executive team is with their mid-level operational folks.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think that really hits the point that I was trying to get at with that question or that hypothetical scenario where, you know, I think first of all, it's important to clarify that most resistance to change doesn't come from a bad place. It's not like you or I are just out there trying to sabotage the project and, you know, I don't like what the company's doing. You see that occasionally, but that's not very common. What typically happens is on the surface, yes, I'm on board, but if I'm not aligned, to your point, if the organization's not aligned, that's going to create unintentionally some resistance to change along the way. Or, you know, one thing you did mention, but it kind of getting down another level of granularity more to a personal level is if you threaten my world, you know, the world that I'm so accustomed to, then I'm going to resist change. Not because not because I want any ill will toward the organization or I don't trust leadership necessarily, or even it may not even be that I don't, I'm not against the change. It's just, I'm okay with the change in general. Just, I don't like the way it's affecting me. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like that becomes, you multiply that times however many employees you have. That's the resistance you have to deal with. It's that underlying unexpected resistance.
It's interesting on some of our organizational change surveys, we do tenure-based surveys where we will have specific areas and we'll do it by tenure and we'll do it by organization. It's kind of funny sometimes when you see the tenure. There's a difference of perspective when you look at tenure. So some of that's just I've been doing it this way for so long, and change is a little harder for some folks. So it's an age thing, but it's also a personality thing. Some people, I think, consultants, for example, we're creatures of change, and so we tend not to get uncomfortable when change occurs. But some folks like a more static environment, so it's a personality thing. So.
Yeah, and if I've been in an organization for a long time and I've created value for myself by powering through the fact that we have such inefficient processes and bad systems, but yet I'm able to navigate that and figure out a way to add value, that's a threat. If you talk about automating the systems and taking away some of those manual processes and some of those heroics that the organization has depended on me personally for, that's a threat, that's a risk, and I start to feel at risk. And so that's where the resistance oftentimes stems from, is that real personal level. What about here's a question that's right up your alley. It's actually a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about now, but it's sort of like a downstream thing that I know you're very well versed in, which is how important is it to have a cost estimate done and agreed with the vendor before getting into implementation, and how can you manage the potential cost escalation along the way? So we're sort of getting into PMO, project governance, and that sort of thing here. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. For us, the cost estimation actually starts during the digital strategy transformation. We use our own set of tools to go through some high-level initial estimation, and that's exactly what it was. I think the key with cost is to also make sure that whatever cost estimation, that you put some parameters around it so that everyone understands exactly what you're looking at and what the implications are coming out of a specific cost estimate. So as we move from a digital strategy to a software selection, to maybe an implementation readiness, to the actual implementation, you're seeing the cost estimates become more real as you the cycle. So I think it's important as you're going through the process of developing cost estimates that you understand where you are in the cycle and what value. I had one customer, we did some cost estimation coming out of digital strategy. And of course, there's always some concern about, well, what do I do with this, right? If I've got to go to a board, how do I position? So it's really important to make sure that you position the cost estimate so that the audience that's targeted understands what it means and what the implications are, and what's the value at this point in looking at a specific estimate. So I think a point is just to recognize where you are in the cycle and where and how you position an estimate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, downstream, when you get into implementation and you start executing that digital strategy, that's where the project governance, the controls, all that stuff becomes so important.
Yeah. And the implementation project, you know, obviously, right before an implementation, your SI, your system integrator is probably going to have gone through some type of discovery to really specifically nail down as best they can and a statement of work for a contract. So, you know, at that point, obviously, from a system integrator standpoint, they're going to be about as close as they're going to get until they actually get into the implementation. Obviously, even when you get into implementation, there is some potential for change because I get in there, I start to uncover things that I couldn't see before, or invalidated assumption about the project, and that changes the cost because there's some additional effort to get done. So absolutely.
Right. So I guess the last question for you is sort of a capstone to tie this all up, this whole thread of digital strategy and software selection. What do you think, as we think and cast our minds forward to our digital strategies for the 2020s, even though this is a digital strategy, to your point, is not just about technology, it's about the people, the process, the overall strategic alignment, all the stuff you talked about, data, infrastructure, all that stuff's important. But when you think about technology and we're looking at different digital options in the marketplace, what are some of the most important technology trends that organizations should be aware of as they define their digital strategies? Or what are some of the emerging technologies or trends that you think, you know, people should really have top of mind or consider that they might not otherwise?
Let's see here. Well, certainly migration to the cloud, and I keep saying this, but making sure you understand with cloud and migration to the cloud, the different components, the different iterations of cloud implementations. And I'm going to come back to the public versus the private, making sure you understand what that looks like in terms of your own organization. But certainly that's probably the most important trend right now. Making sure that your points of integration and the technologies around supporting that are very important. Because again, everything, because we're building, now we've kind of moved more to a Lego kind of, if I can use that, a Lego world where we're building a framework where I've got a platform that allows me to build in and take out components. It becomes very important. So making sure, and I say cloud, but just making sure that your infrastructure, that layer allows for change, because you're on a path. You got to look at this as a path, a journey. And I'm going to assume you are going to be changing your technology. So I think that becomes very important. Not in addition to just your software as a service, that software layer and the data layer, but to make sure that your infrastructure layer is addressing your long-term needs. And it becomes even more important because I always use that example of building a house on sand. If you build a house on sand, it's going to sink. So building your digital strategy on a strong foundation so that I can change. One of the scenarios that we had for one of our clients here recently was all things equal. We had to look at their strategy around the platform of the infrastructure vendor they were going to go with. And ultimately it dictated what software provider they were going to go with, because they had invested a long-term strategy in a cloud solution, cloud provider, the tie between one cloud provider and the other layers of this technology stack, data and application, became more important. It was actually the game changer for the decision process versus the other two finalists, where they had the software and platform layer being owned by two different organizations. So, and that they hadn't made a significant investment. It became a big part of the decision process. So,
Very
for
interesting.
me, so those tend to be the ones, the area that for me is more about making sure that you understand the components and the decision process around the components as opposed to some of the technology trends.
Yeah, it's a good point, because we can get caught up in analysis paralysis, as I mentioned before, but looking at machine learning and AI and RPA and lots of cool stuff, right? I mean, a lot of the vendors are investing pretty heavily in these emerging technologies, but to your point, it's the different components of the digital strategy that's the more important thing. It's making sure it all fits and supports your strategy.
For sure. Some of the ones you just mentioned, you're seeing. I personally have not looking at ERP solutions. Business intelligence is still a dominant theme when we're talking about solutions. It's been in particular where people are trying to really get a 360 view of things. I want to see the 360 view of my customer, self-service capabilities, so that I can allow my customers and suppliers and other partners to have an understanding of how they're interacting with me. The Internet of Things has become, I'm seeing that more and more as we discuss technology solutions. So all the ones that we just talked about, but we're seeing those, but they're, again, they're becoming more and more the extensions. And so we have to just focus on the components and making sure that our drivers are validating any technology solutions. For me, the trend around digital transformation, building the blueprint and the strategies and the roadmaps are becoming more trend, because organizations are starting to recognize the importance of investing in the effort to make sure they understand. And it's not just the big, the large cap kind of firms that are doing that. Some of the small organizations are recognizing now that they need to really be taking a little bit more holistic view, because it's the life, especially in the smaller firms, it's the life or death of my business. If I don't understand, I had one small company, just one more time, one small company, and they were not very efficient in their supply chain. All the classic problems, I can't see, there's no integration, and the speed of delivery was the most important aspect of their business. And because they use a lot of international, they exported, having a digital connection to their shipment, the ocean carriers, was extremely important. So you can see right away, having a holistic view of the business, I can't just fix one area without understanding all of the business. So that became very important for them.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, good. Well, that's a good overview. I know there's a lot we didn't talk about. We could spend a couple more hours talking about this, but I think that's a good place to leave it for now, and give kind of a primer or an introduction to some of the things to be thinking about digital strategy. And thanks for being here today, so Tony. I really appreciate having you on the show. And people can reach you on LinkedIn. They can certainly connect with you, Tony.
Absolutely.
Ford. Yep.
I'm there.
Tony Ford, Third Stage Consulting. You'll find him there. And our website is thirdstage-consulting.com if you want to learn more about digital strategy and that sort of thing. And again, this is thank you to the audience for being here too and asking such great questions. We're going to make this part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which will come out a week from tomorrow. So on every Wednesday, we put out new episodes that include these live interviews as well as other content and other segments that we produce for the podcast. And that comes out on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as well as all the audio podcast platforms as well. So you can check that out every Wednesday on any of those platforms that you might prefer. So I want to thank everyone again for being here today. Have a great rest of your week. We do these Tuesday live streams every Tuesday, so be sure to check us out and follow us for more good content like this on any of the social media channels. You can follow Third Stage or myself on there as well. So thanks again, Tony. Thanks everyone for being here, and have a great.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate it.
All right, take care.